Welcome to Trump Deck Teachings, Zoo, kind of part 2, because it's new standard. This particular version of Zoo is a bit different than the other Deck Teachings Zoo video that I've done. It has a lot of the same cards, but the concept is different enough that I felt like it warranted its own video again. This Zoo, in contrast to the other Zoo, has several more 1-drops in it. This is probably the deck that is at the highest level of competitive with the most number of 1-drops. There's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11, 13, there's 15 1-drops in it. Of course you don't actually count the Soulfire, the Power of Roaming, and the Mortal Coil. When you count proactive 1-drops or what you want, that's 10 though, that's still a lot. So the concept of this Zoo, or the concept of Zoo in general, stays the same. You play minions on curve, except with so many 1-drops you pretty much never miss your 1-drop, and if you're going on, if you're going second, you almost never miss your 2 1-drops, especially if you hard mulligan for them. You play those cards, and then in the future after that, you keep playing on curve. You keep dictating the pace by getting favorable trades in with cards like Abusive Sergeant, Direwolf Alpha, and Defender of Argus, and Knife Juggler. Special cards from Whispers of the Old Gods, which have made it in here. Darkshire Councilman, a card I grossly underestimated, because it's after you summon a minion, gain +1 attack, which means when Possessed Villager dies, Darkshire Councilman gets a buff. When Imp Gang Boss takes damage, Darkshire Councilman gets a buff. And you can simply play Darkshire Councilman on turn 3. It has 5 health. It's pretty tough to deal with, especially if your opponent has no board at that point. You can play Darkshire Councilman, and in the late game, Forbidden Ritual can become a lot of damage. The concept is very simple with this deck. You play your cards, you control the early game with some very good trades, and then at some point in the game, you start going for the face. It's possibly never. Against an aggressive deck, you should always control the board. But against controlled decks, there's a new trick with this deck. The inclusion of Leroy Jenkins and Soulfire. You can burst them out at the end, with Leroy Jenkins and Soulfire being 10 damage, with Leroy Jenkins' Power of Roaming, Soulfire being a total of 18 damage. And you can even get more than that if you Dark Peddler some more Power Overwhelmings. That's not to say that you shouldn't just use the Power Overwhelmings to get favorable trades in. You can gain a lot of tempo by using a Power Overwhelming on a minion, basically dealing 4 damage for 1 mana. That's a lot. I used this deck to climb at the highest point of last month on the final day to rank 50. So it's a really good deck. It's especially good against Shaman and Druid. One of the worst matchups for this deck turns out to be Tempo Warrior, because this deck will have a lot of 1/1s come out, and Tempo Warrior has that ghoul, very scary ghoul. Against Warrior, there's actually a little bit of a mini-game when you're going second, because they have a card called Fiery War Axe, which deals 2 damage. Wow, I forgot what Fiery War Axe did. It's 2 mana and it deals 3 damage. It's pretty good. So if you were going second against a Warrior, the best cards to play are Possessed Villager and Ardent Squire, because that negates the point of Fiery War Axe by quite a bit. However, since I was going first, I could play the Flame Imp safely, because then you would have to coin Fiery War Axe, and if you have to use the coin to develop the Fiery War Axe, it's not as bad. I'm going to play the 2 1-drops and hit face, because it doesn't look like he can do a favorable exchange with his slime into this card. The worst thing that could happen to me is he uses slime and hits this, and then he does the coin and does the ghoul, but if that happens, then that's just kind of rough. What can you do, really? The ghoul is going to get you in a lot of ways. Or the whirlwind. But in the case of a ghoul or a whirlwind, at least there's some friendly fire, and that slime also does. So yeah, this is very standard Zoo gameplay. You play a 1-on-1, you play 2 1s on 2. That typically is the best start you can get. I'm going to play the Knife Juggler before tapping here, because if this minion throws the knife at this thing... No, actually it doesn't matter, I'm going to tap anyways. Tap Blast, oh well. I guess one of the big things to teach about Zoo, which I mentioned in the last Zoo teachings, is if you plan to tap, you should usually tap first. Unless there's some other random stuff that needs to be resolved first, such as knives, but in this case the knives were irrelevant.
Let the pain speak to me.
The Direwolf Alpha is really good in this deck. Make sure to place your minions appropriately. Oh dear, I've actually placed my minions inappropriately. Generally, you want to make sure that your minions go on the... Oh man, this could be a lesson in its own right. And I didn't go that much into it in Deck Teachings number 1. But basic concept, in order to keep the Imp Gang boss on the left side, spawning guys to the right, you want to play your knife. You want to play almost every minion on the right by default, because then the Direwolf Alpha has a higher chance of buffing all of those cards. I'm going to tap first because I intend to play Direwolf Alpha in Argent Squire. There's a little bit of unfortunateness that can happen if this hits that, but oh well. So this will hit this. Spawn a guy. The knife will be thrown. Hopefully it hits that. If it does hit that and I play the Argent Squire, and it also hits that, then this imp can trade into that. Otherwise, okay, well that was pretty good. Otherwise I would have to trade both in, which wouldn't be too bad. Also, along the concept of wolves in general, you want the Argent Squire and you want the Possessed Villager to be at the very end, because you want your cards to slide. So for example, when this imp dies, this card can get a buff. Best targets for Defender of Argus are generally Argent Squire, because this gets a double buff, because the Divine Shield the first time still holding, and then the second one. So I'm going to tap here and then Defender of Argus. It is important to know, based off of matchup as well, when it is appropriate to tap or when it's appropriate to play Voidwalker plus Defender of Argus. This game looks like it's going to still take a little bit of time. So therefore Defender of Argus is superior. Although Darkshard Councilman Voidwalker is not too bad here. It also it presents 2 knives. And it presents the Darkshard Councilman threat. I'm gonna play Darkshard Councilman. A little bit of care with the Bloodwalkers. Even though I don't have the Direwolf Alpha in play right now, you can always draw Direwolf Alpha later, so it's very helpful to have your guys already in place. One of the most positioning-based decks is this deck. So again, general rule of thumb, Imp Game Boss goes furthest left, Argent Squires and Possessed Villager go on the edges, priority right edge or left edge if the right edge is already taken. Cards with big amounts of health, such as Darkshard Councilman, follow the same rule. They want to go on the edge because you can't trade them in as easily with the Direwolf Alpha. It's quite a mouthful. Don't be afraid of tapping. Hey! Don't be afraid of life. It's all just a resource. Until you die. But the good news is if you, well, you basically need to keep tapping, otherwise you will not be able to kill your opponent. There's also the idea of playing around Brawl, and you have to read your opponent correctly on whether or not they have Brawl. Decks with Battle Rage and Frothing Berserker generally do not have Brawl, but it's possible they do. I see often enough that zoos are going to be at like 10 health and they won't tap, even though they're at a bad position on the board. Like, this is a good position, of course, but if you're in a bad position, you're not going to improve your position just by not tapping. Often it's still right to tap, unless you're in a very specific circumstance where dropping down to a certain health threshold means that the card they're holding in their hand is going to kill you.
protect the one. Your soul shall be mine.
Alright, mulliganing as a zoo. Here's something that may not be immediately obvious, but remember you're running 10 1-drops. If you have Dark Peddler and you don't have a 1-drop, mulligan Dark Peddler, because it's not good enough. You want to start off with a 1-drop. Unfortunately, sometimes, in very rare circumstances, and I still get one more draw at it, you will not get a 1-drop, and that is unlucky when you have 10 1-drops. Do not be afraid to toss it all for the 1-drops. And mulligan away the coil and the power overwhelming, the soulfire, of course. Those aren't 1-drops. I mean, in this case, even Mortal Coil would have been a 1-drop. Anyways, at the very least, even though we missed and we have these cards, which are only useful when we have the board, and that card's useless, and that card's useless. At least the 3-drop is there, and then leading into the 4-drop. Dragon Egg can get Defender of Argus, Possessed Villager is a good card by default. Zoo versus Druid tends to be a good matchup, just because Druid has a tough time removing a lot of cards from Zoo. It's very difficult. In this particular hand, I didn't get very many good cards. Like, these are all cards which require a little bit of support. However, I did at least tap into 2 1-drops there. Tap/draw into it, which is likely. This is a common occurrence.
I'm ready to learn. Another night on the prowl.
And cards that are efficient when you are winning on the board, they happen. Now, unfortunately, Power Overwhelming will cause this not to die. I was going to play Defender of Argus on just one guy, but I'm going to tap instead. I'm going to actually play Mortal Coil instead, because drawing first is nice. And that's a target that I would want to coil. And then I tap, and then I Power Overwhelming, and then I play Voidwalker, and the other 1-drop. I meant to do that? No, I actually meant to play Possessed Villager. I thought I could play both. My math was not the best there.
Another night on the prowl.
But finally, there are 2 cards on the board for Defender of Argus. However, drawn was Argent Squire, which is excellent to get Defender of Argus because of the Divine Shield bonus. So I'm going to do that instead of buffing these. I could play Mortal Coil, but better to use the minion that can still take the damage. Small note, I had said in the last game that it was good form to keep the guys at the edge due to Direwolf Alpha. However, I don't have a Direwolf Alpha in my hand, and I put this in the middle because it's the card that I most likely was going to buff with Defender of Argus. So these general rules are meant to be broken sometimes in terms of positioning. Abusive Sergeant is really nice to use against minions, so I try not to play it in order to deal damage to face. That said, though, due to the way that this board is, I'm going to do it and then miss 1 damage because I was going to play that to protect these guys from getting swiped from 1 health. Zoo is a proactive deck, but because it has very many buffs in it, you do often end up playing around what your opponent can do as well. You plan out what they can play, so you can plan out what cards you play and what cards to hold, so you can buff your guys. Big picture, guys, big picture. Now here you can see the power of the Direwolf Alpha. It is going to come into play and immediately deal 6 points of damage. No, it'll deal 4 points of damage. Huh. Okay, but suppose I played the Direwolf Alpha here. Then this 3 and this 3 goes here, and then these both die, and then this deals 3 damage, and this deals 3 damage. And sometimes you can get very long conga lines going. That's pretty good, but power overwhelming on this is even better. But possibly even better is Mortal Coil on that. And then the tap. And then the Councilman. And then the power overwhelming. Possessed Villager buffs Councilman, which is pretty nice. And you can see how Zoo just has a really tough time dealing with the flood of guys. They don't have a good answer. The tap just keeps overwhelming them. Poor Druids. Zoo is a great matchup against them. Did I say Zoo has a tough time? Druid has a tough time dealing with Zoo. Zoo has a really great time in this matchup. If Druid becomes popular, Druid's a good go-to. We kind of actually saw the best and worst matchups in these games. Tempo Warrior is a tough matchup because of the ghouls. Druid's an easy matchup because you just beat them up and it's tough for them to remove mass amounts of stuff in a cost-efficient manner. That wasn't even close. So, that's Zoo. Pretty straightforward. You play your cards on curve. You mulligan aggressively for your 1-drops. You make sure to take good trades when you can. You realize the moment when you should stop trading and go for the face, which is sometimes never. And then sometimes it's pretty early. And it changes based on whether or not you have burst in your hand, like Leroy and Power. And you just control the board and win. That's Zoo. One final word about Zoo. Zoo's worst enemy is getting board cleared. Fortunately, they got one more answer to board clear in this expansion, which is Forbidden Ritual. You want to make sure to position your board so that it does not die to the common board clear that the opponent has. So, for example, against Paladin, play around Consecration, around Druid, play around Swipe. Priest, consider Holy Nova. Warrior, consider Brawl. The way to play around Brawl is by tapping more. And of course, Ghoul, deal 1 damage to everything. When you're afraid of AoE, tap and buff appropriately.